if it does get.
Okay, great. Great. Right. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome, and thank you for coming to the Tribal Drinking Water Team Update session. I'm Emmanuelle Rapicavoli. I'm the team leader. Before we begin, I would like to first acknowledge that I'm presenting today from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush and Muwekima Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of what we now call San Francisco. I'm grateful for their ongoing stewardship of this land and wish to honor their ancestors, elders, and relatives, and affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. The topics we are presenting today all relate to EPA's efforts to improve drinking water quality in tribal communities. I personally value the partnerships that we have with tribal utilities and tribal leadership to help us our trust responsibility to ensure the delivery of safe drinking water and sanitation on tribal land. I may not have all the answers. My staff does a really great job helping to connect tribal utilities with the best resources. So reach out to your tribal drinking water team program managers if you need technical or infrastructure assistance or have any questions we can help. We'll work with our partners to find the solutions. So I wanted to give you a preview of the day. A bunch of topics to discuss, and I'm excited to present some updates of what we've been working hard on. And as always, we love questions, so please feel free to ask questions. Please post questions in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them concurrent with the presentations. And at the end of the session, we'll have some time to take more in-depth questions for the speakers that are in the chat. So we're going to start with a quick update on infrastructure funding. I know this has been a topic that's been well covered at the conference, but it never hurts to give another plug for this. So Nancy is going to walk us through a quick summary of the current and upcoming opportunities for funding. Then Jason Gambatese is going to talk about PFAS sampling and drinking water project and how tribal water systems can participate in the next for sampling. And then Andrew Sallach is going to talk to us about drought and climate resiliency, and he'll present resources to tribes to support those efforts. And then Greg Gholson will first give us an update on the Water Infrastructure Needs Survey. That's DWINSA, the acronym in the presentation. And then he'll talk about some of the requirements under America's Water Infrastructure Act to conduct risk assessments and emergency response plans, and some upcoming that are available to all tribal water utilities, regardless if they need to meet their AWIA requirements for certification. These are great resources to build resiliency. And then again, we'll take questions. So I'll give just a really brief overview of the proposed infrastructure legislation. And I know this has been covered before, so I'll try and walk through it quickly. Again, this is not, but this is what we know kind of so far at EPA, and I know the question has come up in previous sessions. So the infrastructure proposal proposes two very large increases to existing programs: the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. The national 5-year bill, so would propose increases to funding over a 5-year period, and this is in addition to the president for FY22 that include 14% and 20% increases respectively to these programs. So the 5-year funding for each of the revolving funds is $11.7 billion, and that Tribe usually receive 2% as a set aside, and that equates to $234 million or $47 million a year, which represents about 44% increase over FY21 for the clean water, 108 increase over FY21 for drinking water. So these are big increases to the programs that are being discussed in Congress. The proposed legislation also includes new programs under the SR. So we don't know how these programs are going to be allocated across the country, or if or kind of how the tribal set-asides would be allocated. We expect there would be a tribal set-aside, but we don't have the details. But I just wanted to make folks aware that these are the programs that are included in the bill. And then $1 billion for emerging contaminants in the clean water SRF, and $4 billion in the for drinking water, for emerging contaminants in drinking water. It also includes $15 billion for lead service replacements, and another $5 billion under the Small and Disadvantaged Community Grant Program for emerging contaminants. So as you can see, there's a lot of funding being proposed to address emerging contaminants, and on the drinking water side, we're excited to talk about a sampling program that might help inform some of that and advocacy that you all can do for that funding. With that, I'll hand it over to Nancy, and she is going to talk about how to get your funding needs in front of us for consideration for FY22. Thanks.
Thank you. If you missed our session this morning on the infrastructure funding, I encourage you to go back and take a look at the presentations from that session. Lots of information from EPA, IHS, USDA, and HUD on all of the funding programs that we have. But just an update on our tribal drinking water set aside first. We have a solicitation currently open and proposals are due November 19th. At this time, we're not asking for full application through grants.gov, so things are a little bit easier at this point in time. Basically, we need you to submit a 2-page proposal form. That's on our website, that's listed here, and a tribal endorsement for the project. Some projects may require some additional information, but what we will do is look at all of that information on November 19th and request additional information that might be needed, most likely in January of 2022. This year, as Emmanuelle said, we are potentially expecting more funding, so we are encouraging lots of proposals from tribes this year. Generally, we have a ranking system with 9 health priorities, and generally we get down to maybe priority number 8. Last year, we were actually able to fund some projects within our priority number 9, and we're hoping to get there again this year, and maybe even a little further down the list. So some of the things that we're encouraging proposals for that previously have ranked lower on our list maybe are projects addressing emerging contaminants like PFOA and PFAS, projects addressing contamination that's approaching an MCL. Those projects generally rank lower than those that are already exceeding an MCL. Iron and manganese removal projects, and then just replacement of aging infrastructure, water tanks that aren't necessarily yet significant deficiencies, but could be in the near future. So that's for our drinking water set aside projects. And for clean water, we are going through the process right now. IHS will be delivering us a list of projects from their sanitation deficiency system around November 1st. So it's really important that you reach out and get your projects listed on SDS. And that's a process that they go throughout the year to create. So you may have already been working with them on that. But that's the key thing for our projects, since all of our funding for projects for clean water come from that SDS list. That's all I have.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. So get those projects. We're excited to see them. So I'll move on and hand it over to Jason, who's going to talk about the PFAS sampling project.
Good afternoon. So I have the great pleasure to talk to you about this exciting project we're working on, sampling for PFAS chemicals. Next slide. So what is PFAS? This is, you probably have seen this in the news and stuff. These are kind of what we refer to as forever chemicals. They're the per and polyfluoroalkyl alkyl substances, and these are man-made chemicals produced, all the way back into the 40s. They're in a large array of different consumer products and other other uses, such as firefighting foam and numerous products out there. You can find it in the air, the soil, and the water. So EPA is looking at, we've got funding to do sampling for these chemicals, and we're offering a free program to conduct this sampling. So I'll get into that in a second. So next slide. Okay, so a little bit of history on PFAS. So back in 2013 and 2015, PFAS was part of the UCMR, and 11 different tribal systems sampled under that back then. California and Arizona have done some statewide sampling events in the recent past. EPA has set up a health advisory level for a combination of PFOA and PFAS at 70 parts per trillion. And then earlier this year, we made the decision to regulate 2 of these chemicals, PFAS and PFOA. And then as well, these 29 different PFAS compounds have been included in the UCMR 5, which is going to include all tribal systems serving at least 3,300 people and a smaller subset of the systems below 3,300. Next slide. So as part of this program, we're offering sampling at any tribal water system, and this will, the sampling will include 25 different PFAS compounds. And so as part of this, we are offering, we will cover the cost of the analysis and the shipping. And this program is voluntary and non-regulatory, but as I mentioned, this is something we are moving towards regulation on 2 of these compounds. So, our goal is to kind of get ahead of the game and see which systems may have issues with these contaminants. To participate in this study, there will be certain data sharing requirements, and I'll talk about that later. But essentially, if you get any hits for these contaminants, we expect that information to be shared with the customers. So if you decide to participate, we will send out sample bottles and all the shipping material. We will help with collecting the samples and provide what you need to send that cooler back to the lab. We have contracted with RCAC and they're trained to collect these samples, and they can be on site and assist with this. This is a very unique kind of sampling effort in the sense that cross-contamination is a big deal with this, because this contaminant, PFAS compounds are in so many different products. It's very easy to contaminate the sample. So the sample protocol is very important to follow in order to get an accurate reading. Next slide. So initially, we are proposing or offering to sample all entry points at every regulated public water system, as well as the majority of the sources. The only cases where we won't sample a source is if the source just feeds an entry point by itself and the treatment is just chlorine or nothing, or no treatment. Basically, we're looking at any situations where, the entry point result may not accurately capture what's coming out in the source or sources. So that's why we may take both entry point and source samples. But if we do have a detect, we will take follow-up samples at both entry point and sources, because as I said, there are potential contamination or cross-contamination issues, such as Teflon tape that may be on a hose bib, for example. That is a source of PFAS. So next slide. So you hopefully saw in the summer an invitation to participate in this program. If you have not, please reach out to your EPA program manager if you're interested. The sampling is going to start this fall. Actually, it's going to start in about 2 or 3 weeks. We already have some systems lined up to start sampling, and we'll continue this on a rolling basis at least through next summer. The lab indicated that they could probably get us results in about a month after the samples are received. And once we get those, we will be sharing them with the water systems. Next slide. So consumer notification, next slide. Now, as I mentioned, if you would like to participate in this sampling effort, there is some conditions, and we would like the water system to agree to certain consumer notification requirements. But when we send out the results, we will provide templates for these consumer notifications. We will provide advice on mitigation activities that you may need to or want to take to address any potential hits. It will help with looking for the source of the contamination and potential options for treatment on alternative source. So as I mentioned, PFAS and PFOA have a health advisory level. It's a combined value of 70 parts per trillion for those two compounds. And next slide. When those levels are seen at a well, when they're seen at an entry point, we will ask that the system send out a public notice within a week of receiving these results, warning them of these levels. If the source, if the 70 is at the well, we'll have to figure out if that's representative of what the customers are drinking, or if that is just taken care of through blending or whatever the case may be, that we're seeing a lower result at the entry point. Next slide. So in addition to this public notice, if you have a level above 70 on the combined contaminants, any other contaminant or these contaminants as well, if you have a detect but below the health advisory level, we're asking all community water systems to put this data in their CCR just as you would if you were collecting under the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. As well, for non-community water systems that do not have a CCR, we ask that they provide some type of similar notification, such as a posting to the customers, or typically for like a casino or something, to the worker population, and you provide that as well within 1 year. Okay, next slide. So another element of the sharing of the data, EPA is creating a public-facing website that will house all of this information. If you want to participate, you have the option of opting out of this website. You need to let us know in writing. Email is fine, and you can opt out of this requirement if you are committing to these other forms of communication that I just went over. Next slide. And that is all. So, if you, like I said, if you haven't heard from us and you're interested, please reach out to your program manager. We will also be following up with all the systems that we had not heard from previously that we had reached out to in the summer. So you may see another notice from us coming up soon. Thank you.
So I'll hand it over to Andrew, who's going to talk about drought and climate resiliency.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending. I'm Andrew Sallach. I work with water systems up in Northwest California and Eastern Arizona. So on the next slide here is the U.S. Drought Monitor. I find this a useful tool prepared by several agencies in the federal government and college. Also, they do ground truthing of this. So you can see, a lot of California and Nevada is in severe drought. Arizona over the past several months has gotten a little bit less red. I think thanks to some monsoon rains. But as we know, the Colorado River is still in. I don't know.
We may have lost Andrew. Can folks hear me? I want to make sure it's not. You got it. Okay. So maybe what I'll do while we wait for Andrew to come back is skip through to Greg, and then we can come back and trying to connect. So let me skip through these slides, and then we can come back. And if he doesn't make it back, we can try and cover them ourselves. So,
well, great. Then if you can hear me, I will start.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, folks. So I'm Greg Gholson, member of the Tribal Drinking Water Team in Region 9, and I'm going to chat today with you about the Drinking Water Infrastructure Needs Survey and Assessment. That's a mouthful. We refer to it as the WINSA. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the DWINSA. It's not just any survey, but it's grounded in our statute, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and was mandated by the 1996 amendments, and it directs EPA to conduct a periodic needs survey. The mission statement of the DWINSA is to assess the capital improvement needs of SRF eligible public water systems in the U.S. and Indian country for drinking water infrastructure construction, rehabilitation, and replacement for the 20-year period. The 20-year period being 2021 through the end of 2040. So again, we're trying to project the needs for these projects and associated costs. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the American Indian or Tribal DWINSA. Just a moment to let you know that this is I believe this is the fourth Tribal DWINSA. That may not be represented accurately here, but I did want to highlight that this DWINSA was prepared from previous tribal surveys, and it went through formal consultation between September and November of 2019. Next slide, please. So, what exactly is this survey? Well, it's a big data collection effort. And as I mentioned before, we're collecting information on the 20-year infrastructure needs for really everything within your drinking water system, from examples of well pump replacement, tank and treatment plant rehabilitation, distribution system replacement, in some cases, new wells, if existing wells do not provide sufficient capacity for current needs. I'll pause here and explain that the survey only allows us to capture the cost for projects to meet your current population needs. We can't project for future growth, unfortunately. And the survey applies, just a little more detail there, to existing community and not-for-profit non-community water systems. So it's a pretty big net, and we'll need your assistance in completing it. So next slide, please. So how's the data collected? In broad strokes, Region 9 as your primacy agency, it's us, your program managers that are diving into the survey form and completing the survey form with your input. In some instances, we've asked IHS and RCAC to assist us in this effort. That could be through conference calls or site visits in some instances. The scope of the survey for our Region 9's tribal DI program is 55 systems within the region. That excludes systems within the Navajo Nation that are subject or have been, I should say, selected to participate in the survey. Within Navajo Nation, I believe there's 34 community water systems, and as a primacy agency, Navajo EPA staff are completing those surveys and working with those community water systems. The survey entails information gathering to document project needs. What I'm trying to highlight here is the fact that in most cases, we have that information either through data you've provided us as part of project applications historically, or possibly to IHS as part of your work with them on a variety of projects over the years. However, there are instances where there's a project we might not know about. The best example, a project that would be funded by a tribe independently, maybe through a capital improvement plan. In those instances, we wouldn't have the details, and we would be relying on you to provide us some of those background documents necessary to support inclusion of that project. My last bullet here, approximately 75% of the systems selected were surveyed in 2011. The key message here is the statistical approach for conducting the survey was changed to make our job a little easier. Those surveys that were previously, those systems that were previously surveyed in 2011, we're starting from pre-populated survey forms. So our job's a lot easier. Essentially, we just have to update those 2011 surveys to 2021. Much of the infrastructure is the same. In a lot of cases, the need's the same. So that's a big help. Next slide, please. So where are we? We're about halfway through. We've reached out to many of you and work with you all to complete surveys and get those initial submittals in. However, we're only halfway done. That means your program managers may be reaching out to you with requests for conference calls to discuss the survey, solicit your participation, and in some instances gather more documentation so that we can get these initial surveys submitted to headquarters and their contractor by December 10th. That will allow a few months, for our headquarters folks to review those surveys, get us comments, and allow for revisions before the end of February. Next slide, please. So you might be thinking, well, what happens with all of this data? It's kind of a big deal. The results of the survey are massaged into a report for Congress, and that report is used to determine the regional distribution of drinking water tribal set-aside funds. So our funding is directly linked to this effort. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, there are a lot of tribal or federally recognized tribes in Region 9. For that reason, our data is weighted a little heavier, and the tribal drinking water infrastructure needs in our region, in some cases, will inform the nationwide need, again, highlighting the importance of your participation. That's really my last bullet. Your participation is critical to this survey, and more importantly, our drinking water tribal set-aside funding that we use to support infrastructure improvement programs in Region 9.
Thank you.
So that was a lot of details on DWINZA. I'm going to shift here to another amendment of the Safe Drinking Water Act. That is the America's Water Infrastructure Act, or AWIA. Next slide, please. So AWIA is a big deal. The AWIA provisions are the most far-reaching changes to the Safe Drinking Water Act since the 1996 amendments. And AWIA established a whole bunch of new programs to improve drinking water and support infrastructure investment. A few of those here are amendments to the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, requiring chemical release reporting to community water systems. I thought that was pretty interesting, as I used to work in EPCRA, getting my federal acronyms mixed up, and it's nice to see that coordination across statutes. Similarly, AWIA provided additional funding for testing of drinking water for lead in schools and child care facilities under the WIN Act programs. And what I'm going to focus on today is the AWIA requirement for community water systems to develop or update risk and resiliency assessments and emergency response plans. Next slide, please. So specific to risk assessments and ERPs, these requirements of AWIA apply to community water systems with service populations greater than 3,300. And the first requirement in this area was for you all or these systems rather, to develop risk assessments and certify those to EPA by June 30th of this year. I can say that with a couple data issues, I think we have 100% compliance within those systems that were required to complete these assessments. So thank you all for the hard work there. That's really a good segue to the emergency response plan, or the second requirement in this area of AWIA. It really builds on the risk assessments, in that the risk assessments, or RAs, are intended to inform and dovetail with the requirements for these same systems to develop emergency response plans, or ERPs, by the end of the calendar year. An example there would be if your risk assessment identified power outages as a system vulnerability, your ERP would likely include details on your system's emergency generators, their type, location, and then proper use and routine maintenance, so that when that generator was needed, you'd be assured that it's been maintained properly, and there are details on its use. So if the regular operator isn't available, hopefully anybody could pick up that ERP and would have the critical information to keep your water system in operation. Next slide, please. Lastly, I know this is a lot of information. I've got some AWIA resources for you here. What I want to highlight is that our headquarters office will be supporting a virtual AWIA ERP workshop for small systems. That will be Monday and Tuesday, November 8th and 9th, from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. We'll be developing a flyer on this and sending it out to you shortly. I did see on EPA's AWIA webpage that you can currently register for this, but if you don't happen to navigate there, be assured your program manager will send you a flyer with registration details here. As you can see, it's a 2-day session, so we'll really get into the weeds, if you will, on how to develop your ERP and respond to questions. So it's a great opportunity if this requirement applies to you. Another opportunity for training would be the Southern California NAUMA meeting hosted by RCAC. That's coming up November 17th. For those tribes in Southern California, this is going to be the first NAUMA, I guess, post-pandemic, or as we're coming out of it, that will allow you to participate in person. That's pretty exciting. However, registration will be open for systems across the region that are interested in participating, including those that aren't subject to AWIA but are interested in resources and discussion of the importance of ERPs for resiliency planning. Lastly, I see here that my hyperlink text is hard to read, but the AWIA website does have excellent information. Just before this session, I simply Googled AWIA and ERPs. It took me directly to the sub-page of AWIA for risk assessments in ERPs. That site's got previous webinars that have been recorded that you can click through and look at your leisure. I'll also highlight that website has emergency response plan templates for small systems that are fillable or clickable, so you can walk through those templates and complete your ERPs with those resources pretty quickly. And lastly, the website has information on how to certify your emergency response plan to EPA prior to the end of the year. So hopefully that was helpful, and you're always welcome to reach out to me with questions about DWINZA or AWIA.
Great. Thank you, Greg. And I encourage kind of all the water utilities to look at those trainings on ERPs. They're not just limited to comply, but they do have some really great resources on developing an emergency response plan. It's a good segue to go back and talk about the drought. So give me a second and I will scroll back to Andrew's slide. And hopefully we can resume that discussion.
Okay, so am I back? No, you cannot hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, yeah, so we left off with this, the U.S. Drought Monitor map, and then next is some, I think you heard what I said about this. And then the next is the Drought Resources. We developed some resources with California Indian Health Service and other federal agencies in California back at the last drought, that last California drought. And so it's a little bit California centric, but a lot of the federal resources are appropriate really anywhere. And then, it was developed in 2015. So some of the resources may be a little bit dated, especially maybe like FEMA and in California. So, but the emergency drinking water supply guidance, and it goes through kind of steps on incident command structure also, and how to get resources for emergency water for either, like bottled water, emergency water lines, truck hauling, things like that is the focus. And that's on the EPA website. There's a link there. And then below that are two programs for California specifically, which they have been talking about for drought mediation and other emergency response planning. And both of these are open to tribes. And I know that some tribes have been able to access the Small Community Drought Relief Program. So I encourage you to check those out if you're interested if you're in California, the state of California. And then lastly is the Water Smart program with the Bureau of Reclamation. And that's, the Bureau of Reclamation is really concerned about water quantity and has, this is a pretty good program. I know some tribes have been able to access this. You may need a drought response, some type of drought response plan in order to access these fundings, but I think they can actually give you funding to do those emergency response plans or those drought response plans. The next slide is about drought response plans. I took this directly from the GAP presentation that was done a month ago, I think, on climate change. And so I just kind of plucked this slide out from there. And it talks about one of the fundable activities under GAP, and that is to develop your drought contingency plan. And this is important sometimes to get funding for other, like I said, from U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. Reclamation may want to see this. And I think it's a really good plan, kind of good way to think about things. And it can also help you, GAP can help you improve measurements or start measuring your water supplies on a regular basis, whether they're wells or surface water, so that you can better manage and predict when you might run into problems and act preemptively. GAP can pay for best management practices, kind of developing options for water supplies, whether it's truck hauling, hauling truck water. So they can help you develop plans for those. So the next is, the third slide is about power resilience. Kind of what Greg was talking about. Greg's program is right there in the middle of the risk and resilience assessment. And here are a lot of other resources. I really like this resource on the left, the Power Resilience Guide. Especially if you're thinking about buying a generator, they go through like what size generator do you need, advantages and disadvantages of different fuel types to use, maintenance of the generators. And they actually go into generating power on site and microgrids. I believe there was a presentation earlier this week on microgrid. So this resource goes into that, and there's an EPA number on that slide too. That's an easy way to find it. So that's a pretty good guide. And a subset of that is the power safety and shutoff. And this was developed by headquarters with Region 9 in response to, all the California wildfire safety measures that we are taking recently. And there's some standard operating procedures, how to plan for it, what to do when you get notice, 48 hours, 24 hours ahead of time, and then things to do afterwards. And then in the center there is cybersecurity. EPA has a grant with Horsley Witten to do some assessments. So if you want an on-site assessment, especially if you have a SCADA system, water control mechanisms that are controlled remotely, you may want to consider taking advantage of this assessment opportunity for your utility. And then on the right are some climate change tools. The CREATE is kind of an in-depth tool. It's the Climate Resilience Evaluation and Awareness tool. That's what CREATE stands for. And part of that is the vulnerability assessment tool. And this is a really neat tool. It'll import the FEMA drought maps. You put in the location of your facility, and then you can tell some of the risks associated with it. So those are some good tools if you want to explore if your system is vulnerable, a little more in depth than the risk and resilience assessment, and come up with some mitigation strategies. Really, the final outcome of these products is different mitigation strategies, low cost, high cost, long-term, short-term mitigation strategies. And then if you just want to really quick, you don't want to go into this whole spending a lot of time with it, EPA also has a resilience strategy guide for water utilities that takes maybe 10 minutes. It's a really quick step, and you come out with different resources and different funding opportunities for your utility. So that is the risk. That is not on here. No, it is right there in the middle. Resilience strategies guide for utilities in the kind of the lighter orange on the right side. So that one is a really quick, easy guide to use. It shouldn't take you more than 20 minutes to go through that, and you can come up with some funding opportunities. It gives you some funding strategies and options. So that's a quick guide. Yeah. So and then next is incident checklists. On the next slide, the EPA has developed all these different checklists on, they go from planning to when, right before when it's happening, and then a little bit about recovery as well. So there's a whole list of different incident action checklists for both water and wastewater utilities. So I encourage you to look at that if you, especially once you kind of look at what your threats are and what you're vulnerable to. The next is a lot of these, checklists and everything involves planning. And one of the big planning things is knowing your neighbor, maybe getting associated with the network, so that if you have some type of incident in your water system, has a major break, or in this case, this is a picture of me assessing what had been a redwood storage tank during one of the wildfires in California, and the utility put in some piping. So whether your tank burns down or you may want, or like I said, you have line breaks. There's these mutual aid networks that every state in our region has. So I encourage you to look at that, consider joining one of those networks. They're called WARNs, for Water and Wastewater Agency Response Networks. They are agreements where you can get supplies or personnel or a backhoe and equipment. Some of it's kind of a mutual trade, other things are, just kind of complementary. Other times it's kind of a reimbursement agreement, and then you can get FEMA funds to reimburse the utility that supplies the mutual aid. But I consider you to look at that, or an option is tribes in a geographic area coming together and saying, well, let's develop a mutual aid program. And I believe GAP can help fund that type of planning activity for tribes, local tribes, to kind of say, hey, let's, not just water utilities, but roads or whatever. Let's figure out how we can trade resources if something happens. In preparation for an emergency. All right, thank you. I'm glad my microphone worked this time.
Yeah, good to have you back, Andrew. Let's see. I'm going to go to the end, which was the questions. I see a new one just popped up. Will this presentation be uploaded to the session? And yes, if I can figure out how to do it, I will definitely upload it. I will figure out how to do it. I'm sorry. I will do that later today. And then I saw a few questions earlier that I thought maybe I could cover just more broadly. There was a question about the PFAS sampling program, whether that was going to be available for private wells, and unfortunately not. The funding that we received to develop this program and conduct the sampling is tied to our regulatory program for regulated public water systems. But if you have a concern about a private well, definitely reach out to us, and we can kind of look at perhaps some of the vulnerabilities in that area and perhaps provide any counsel there. And then is there another question about, oh yes, the Drought Monitor. The data came from the Drought Monitor, that Andrew's drought slide. Let's see. I know we have a few minutes left, so do folks have questions for us, either related to any of these topics or topics in general about drinking water or infrastructure funding? Happy to answer those. Thank you for all hanging with us to the very, very end of the tribal conference. I know it's hard to be the last on the agenda and stick with us, but I appreciate you all participating. All right. Like that. Don't see anything more. Could buy a minute more in case folks have any questions, but again, your tribal drinking water program manager is your best resource to answer your questions, and we're happy to help. So glad you found some gems, Adam. All right. It's always strange for me to present and not be able to interact with folks. So I appreciate your patience and posing questions in the chat. All right. Well, unless anybody has any last minute questions, I'm going to stop the broadcast, and I will upload the PowerPoint to the platform so folks have access to it. Thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And hope to see you all next year at the next Our Talk. Aye.